Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first evening talk of the 2021 Relevant Series, God and Science. Has Science Buried Faith in God? My name is Benjamin Ding, and I'm a fourth year student at the University of Toronto, pursuing a major in chemistry and double minors in mathematics and biology. I'll also be your host for the event tonight. Thanks to everyone all here tonight for joining us. Firstly, we'll be listening to a speaker well-versed in this topic, Tim Barrett. He will later be joined by University of Toronto molecular genetics professor Martha Brown in a Q&A panel. And now I'd like to take some time for the land acknowledgement. It is our duty as Christians to love indiscriminately, as Christ did so for us. As such, we believe that God created all people groups and all lands, including the land currently occupied by the University of Toronto and McGill University campuses. The land used by the University of Toronto was once occupied by the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River for thousands of years. Today, many Indigenous groups from all across Turtle Island still call this place home. Meanwhile, the Haudenosaunee and Anishinabeg settled the land where McGill now sits. We are thankful for the opportunities we have on this land, both to work and to learn. Just to lay some general guidelines for you to keep in mind as you participate in tonight's events. 1, you can email relevant2021@gmail.com. If you have any accessibility needs, we'll do our best to accommodate you. Secondly, don't be afraid to ask challenging or uncomfortable questions. This is the space for that. But please maintain courtesy and respect when doing so. Additionally, please refrain from using any inappropriate language or profanity. Now, I'd like to introduce Elena, who will be sharing her personal story.
Hi, my name is Elena, and I'm a member of the Newman Catholic Student Society at McGill University. I'm currently in my third year at McGill studying anatomy and cell biology, and I'm also completing an independent research project in genetics and developmental biology. I come from a practicing Catholic family who's always taught me to put God at the center of my life. When I was little, this mostly meant following my parents to Mass every Sunday, to listen to some stories about Jesus, and occasionally have a coloring page. But as I got older, my faith really began to take a deeper and more personal dimension. In parallel, I truly discovered this passion for the biomedical sciences when I was 14 and I took my first biology class. And I remember just being so amazed by all these invisible processes and pathways that are ongoing in our bodies and dictating our lives that I pretty much immediately decided that this was what I wanted to study for my entire life. This decision was reinforced with the more classes that I took until one day a girl in one of these classes asked me whether my faith meant that I didn't believe in evolution. And my first reaction was just to be surprised because I'd never really heard of there being a discrepancy between faith and science, especially since I'd grown up being taught that Christians throughout history have contributed to scientific development, and I'd had role models like Blaise Pascal and Gregor Mendel. And then I actually became a little worried because I asked, well, does my faith mean that I truly can't believe in science? And today, a few years later, it seems silly that I could ever be stressed out about something like this. But unfortunately, today's society does view religion as being the polar opposite of science, and this creates a divide that honestly makes no sense if you stop to think about it for just 5 minutes. Scientists aim to discover how and why the world works, and it's been my personal experience, as well as that of many people before me, that science and religion actually beautifully complement one another. And personally, my faith has given me a much deeper awe and appreciation of what I study. Because every day I get to wake up and dive deeper into God's creation. And I found that the more I learn, the more I am amazed by God's incredible design of the world and of man. When research is performed in a purely scientific and moral manner, there can never really be a discrepancy between faith and reason. And it's the same God who gives us faith who's also given us the ability to seek out the truth. So God can't deny himself, and truth can't contradict truth. In the same time, God doesn't ask that we blindly believe in Him just because of a gut feeling or out of tradition. Rather, we're asked by God to know the world that He created, and through this knowledge to know Him. Anyone who's taken the most basic of science classes has had to learn about the scientific method, and it's this process of hypothesis and experiments and observations that eventually lead us to conclude that scientific theories cannot be used to prove theological truths. But by knowing nature through science, we can know God because He is the creator. So living out your faith and putting God above everything else do not contradict the love for science. If anything, honestly, they enhance it. Even the early Christians had to contend with all these erroneous assumptions that faith and science are incompatible. So today we're called to continue their work to make sure that reason and faith are, first of all, properly understood, but also properly employed. So I'd like to end with a citation by Saint Anselm of Canterbury, which encompasses everything that I've just said. And that's, I do not seek to understand in order that I may believe, but rather I believe in order that I may understand. So thank you.
Just a reminder to everyone that if you have a question you'd like to ask the speakers, to please submit them through slido.com using the code #relevant. Check the chat for additional information as well. So our first speaker tonight is Tim Barnett. Tim earned a Bachelor of Science in Physics from York University, a Bachelor of Education from the University of Ontario's Institute of Technology, and a Master of Arts in Philosophy from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Tim serves as an adjunct Bible and science teacher at Innova Academy, a classical Christian school, and serves on the pastoral staff at Cedarview Community Church. He finally acts as a dynamic speaker for Stand to Reason, a Christian organization which helps others think more clearly about their faith. Tim, you have the floor.
Awesome. Well, I want to start here. I'll share my screen with y'all. I want to start by thanking just all the people responsible for organizing this event. I know it's a lot of work to put something like this on. So I just want to say from me, and I'm sure others in the chat and watching, that we really appreciate it. And of course, I want to thank you for allowing me to participate. I want to say hi to everybody. Hi out there. And just say I am so glad to be spending the next hour or so with you tonight. I know there's a million other things that you could be doing tonight and a lot to compete with, Netflix and everything else. And so I think it's really cool that you're going to join me in talking about a really important issue. Are science and faith compatible? Now, I want to jump into this by actually asking you a couple of poll questions, okay? And just to see where you're coming from. So here's my first question to you. When it comes to belief in God, how would you identify? I would identify as a theist, an atheist, or an agnostic. Sorry, I didn't give you more options. There's 3 options there. Just imagine I have the proposition God exists, okay? You either affirm it, so you're a theist, you deny it, you're an atheist, or maybe you don't know. Maybe that's the best position for you. You say you can't know, or maybe you just don't know, and so you want to identify here as an agnostic. And we'll just we'll wait a few more seconds to see where's everybody coming from. Looks like we got a lot of theists tonight, okay? And sorry, I was going to put Muslim, Christian, and go through, but there was no end to it. So I just kept it to the 3. Okay, great. That's great. So it looks like we've got mostly Christians and or theists, I should say, and we have a few agnostics and atheists. And I'm so happy that you guys are with us too, because this is a really important question that we're going to be diving into. Let's go to the next question. And the next question is this. It's the topic of tonight, okay? And I actually put it in terms of a question. I made it a statement that you either affirm or deny, or maybe you're not sure. And the statement is this: science is compatible with faith in God. Science is compatible with faith in God. Do you believe that that's true, do you believe that that's false? Or maybe you're just unsure. So we got a lot of not sures, a lot of trues. Okay. And so so this question tells me whether I'm preaching to the choir or I'm Daniel in the lion's den, so to speak, or maybe we're just, we're all going to learn some stuff here and you're just not sure. And so we got a little mixture between the true and not sure. Okay, good. Here's how we're going to start. This question actually wasn't necessarily a fair statement or question, because there's a lot of different definitions here in play. So when I say science is compatible with faith in God, you might want to ask the question, well, what do you mean by science, for starters? What do you mean by faith? And what do you mean by God? Because how you define those terms is going to determine how you answer the question, okay, whether you affirm or deny. And so that's what we're going to do over the next 20 minutes, okay? And to launch into this, I want to talk about an article that caught my attention in the New Yorker a couple of years ago. It was written by theoretical physicist and atheist Lawrence Krauss, okay? And here's why it caught my attention, because the title says, all scientists should be militant atheists. All scientists should be militant atheists. Okay, so I started reading the article, and it said this commitment to open questioning is deeply tied to the fact that science is an atheistic enterprise. Okay, that was news to me. Science is an atheistic enterprise. It goes on to say, it's ironic, really, that so many people are fixated on the relationship between science and religion. Basically, there isn't one. Okay, no relationship between the two. Now we're going to see in a little bit that would be news to the founders of modern science. Okay, and then finally, it says this: it's inevitable that it, speaking of science, draws people away from religion. And Lawrence Krauss actually means belief in God by religion. Okay, so science is going to draw people away from belief in God. Now, it's actually my experience that science drove me towards God, not away from God. Okay, that's just my own experience. And what I would like to show you is that a proper understanding of faith and a proper understanding of science are perfectly compatible. In fact, rather than destroying faith, I actually think science can be used to strengthen faith, can actually be used to embolden Christian faith. Now, let's start with that word faith, okay? Over time, words have a tendency of changing their meaning. In fact, some words have come to mean the exact opposite of what they used to mean. So take the word awful, for example, okay? The word awful, a century ago, meant to be full of awe. But, I didn't wake up this morning, turn to my beautiful wife and say, honey, you look awful. No, that would be a big mistake. Why? Well, because the word awful has changed its meaning over the last 100 years. In fact, today, the word awful means something like extremely unpleasant or distasteful, kind of like Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Now, that's probably more controversial than this issue. So words have a tendency of changing their meaning. But what about the word faith? Has the word faith changed its meaning? Well, today, the word faith is taken in a certain sense. And I want to show you what that sense is using a video clip from Miracle on 34th Street, like the black and white version, okay? And maybe some of you have seen it. If you haven't seen it, this might be a little bit of a spoiler, okay? But I still want you to watch this short clip. So we're going to play that.
You couldn't get it because you're not Santa Claus, that's why. You're just a nice old man with whiskers, like my mother said. And I shouldn't have believed you.
I was wrong when I told you that, Susie. You must believe in Mr. Kringle and keep right on doing it. You must have faith in him.
But he didn't get me. That doesn't make sense, Mommy.
Faith is believing in things when common sense tells you not to.
Huh?
I think that edit was in the original. No, it wasn't. So you saw what she said. She said faith is believing in things when common sense tells you not to. Now, is that what faith means? Well, if you consult some of the leading atheists, they would say, yeah, that's exactly what faith means. Okay. So Peter Boghossian is, he's at Portland State University. He's a philosophy professor. He wrote a book I read last year called A Manual for Creating Atheists. And in his book, he defines faith this way. He says, faith is the word one uses when one does not have enough evidence to justify holding a belief, but when you just go ahead and believe anyways. Okay. You just go ahead and believe anyways, even when you don't have the evidence. In fact, he says that faith is pretending to know what you don't know. Faith is belief without evidence. Okay. So on this view, faith being belief without evidence, well, you could see how faith and science are polar opposites. Okay. I mean, science is about evidence. That's when you put you believe something, you get more knowledge because you have all this evidence. On the other hand, you have this faith thing, and that's where you need like wishful thinking because there is no evidence, but you believe anyways. Those are opposites. But is that what faith really is? Well, I don't think so. And a good many scientists don't think so. In fact, here's John Lennox. John Lennox, he was a former Oxford mathematician. And he says faith is a response to the evidence, not rejoicing in the absence of it. It's a response to evidence. Okay, it's something you do once you see the evidence. I think that's right. I think faith is a lot like what we call today trust. Now, here's the thing. If you want to know what faith is, at least biblical faith, it might be a good idea to consult the Bible. Okay. And so, we got smart guy, Peter Boghossian. You got smart guy, John Lennox. They're both saying opposite things. Let's go to the Bible and see who's right. Okay. Now, if you go to John, the Gospel of John, you want to find out why he wrote his gospel, you have to actually go to the very end of the gospel. You want to see why Luke wrote, he tells you on the first page, first chapter. But if you want to see why John wrote his gospel, you got to go to John chapter 20, okay, verses 30 and 31. And here's what John says. He says, now Jesus did many other signs, that's just another word for miracles, many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Okay, John didn't write them down. But then he says this, but these are written. Why, John? So that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Here he tells us why he wrote down all the miracle claims, okay? He wrote them down. Why? So you would believe, and that by believing you would have life in his name. Does this sound? I mean, the whole point of John writing his gospel is to provide trustworthy eyewitness evidence that you and I could read and then believe. Now, does that sound like believing without evidence? Of course not. Does that sound like blind leap in the dark? Of course not. Okay. That's not biblical faith. And so biblical faith is more like trusting something in light of some kind of evidence that you've been given. Today, it means like believing in spite of the evidence. So you can see it's come to mean like the opposite of what it used to mean. Here's just a quick illustration to help drive this point home, because I think it's key, it's crucial in understanding this conflict between faith and science. Imagine you're standing at the edge of Niagara Falls, this magnificent waterfall, and you notice that there's this acrobat named Charlie Blondin, and he's a tightrope walker, and he's walking across performing all these acrobat tricks. And one of them is he walks across the tightrope with a wheelbarrow full of rocks. And you watch him do it once, twice, 5 times, 10 times, 15 times in a row. And he sees you doing it and watching him. And so he comes over to you and he says, do you have faith that I could do it again? Do you believe I could do it again? And you say, yeah, of course. I've seen you do it 15 times in a row. And then he takes the wheelbarrow, dumps the rocks out, and says, okay, hop in. That's biblical faith. Okay, it's not just mere assent. It's not mere belief based on evidence. It's trusting. It's getting into the wheelbarrow. Okay, there's this active commitment or trust that's involved. But of course, it's based on evidence. Now we've looked at faith. On this view of faith, a biblical understanding of faith science is not in conflict with it. In fact, you could have scientific evidence that came about, and we could talk about this in the Q&A. You could have some scientific evidence that actually strengthens your faith. Okay. It's the kind of evidence that builds up your faith. Okay. Now, I want to talk about science for a second. Now, science is interesting because when you look at the history of modern science, something amazing, you'll discover something amazing. And that is that it was birthed out of a Christian worldview, a belief in the Christian God. Okay. C.S. Lewis puts it this way: men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Okay. Now, who are some of these men of science he's talking about? The father of modern science, Francis Bacon. You have Galileo. Don't be tricked into thinking that Galileo was against Christianity. He was a Bible-believing Christian. Okay, so there's a lot of myth around Galileo. We could talk more about that in the Q&A. You have Kepler. He thought he was thinking God's thoughts after God. Pascal and Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, Gregor Mendel, Louis Pasteur, Lord Kelvin, James Clerk Maxwell. The list goes on and on and on. These are the guys who have units named after them. But most people don't know that these guys, many of them were Orthodox Christians, okay? But they were all believers in God. And so I'm wondering, here's a poll question for you. Were you taught, because I'm just curious, were you taught the Christian origins of science? See, I went through the public school system. I went to elementary school, high school, York University, Teachers College. Those were all in the secular system. When I got my master's degree in philosophy, I just wanted to try out a Christian school for once. And because no one told me this stuff. And look, the same is true with most of you. Most of you were like me, had no idea that that modern science was birthed out of kind of a Christian worldview. And so we'll keep moving here, but it looks like, yeah, most of you, 88%, say no. Yeah, just like me. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Actually, this is really interesting. Tom Holland, not Spider-Man. Some of you guys are thinking, Tom Holland, oh, I love him in Marvel movies. No, not Spider-Man. Tom Holland is a historian who has written a number of books, and recently has written a book called Dominion: How the Christian Revolution made the world. Typo. And he was in an interview recently with, what's interesting about Tom Holland is he actually left Christianity as a kid and would, call himself agnostic or whatever. Now, recently, he's identifying more as a Christian, although he doesn't believe in the resurrection. So he's not a Christian in the sense that I would take the word, but he calls himself a Christian. He said this in an interview: without Christianity, we would not have science. Now, that is a pretty provocative claim, but he's written a whole book around this issue. And so you want to check that out. We wouldn't even have it. He says that the Christian God presents a Goldilocks qualities for getting science. Like not too hot, not too cold. Talking about things like order in nature comes from the orderliness of God. He's a God of order. The universal laws come from a God of laws and covenants. Why should we think that we could study God's heavens? We are made in God's image. What's the motivation for doing science? Well, he says it was an act of worship for these men. And so you can see all these things were the recipe for modern science. In fact, the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University, this most prestigious university, has the words Magna Opera Domini Exquisite and Omnis Voluntatis Jesus carved into the doors. And that is actually Psalm 111, verse 2. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. James Clerk Maxwell, arguably one of the greatest physicists in human history, next to Einstein and Newton, he had that put in the doors. For him, God was an inspiration for his science. Many people think that God is a science stopper. If you believe in God, it's going to stop science, when in reality, it was the modern science starter. As John Lennox puts it, it was the motor driving science. The Christian worldview was driving science. That's how it started. Okay. So don't let anyone tell you that belief in God is going to stop progress in science. But some people are going to say, whoa, Tim, you don't understand. Years ago, superstitious people thought that lightning came from the lightning god and thunder from the thunder god. But now we know lightning is just an electrical discharge. And thunder is just rapidly heated, expanded air molecules, makes that noise. We don't need God for that. And so over time, supernatural explanations are decreasing. We call this sometimes the God of the gaps. People call this the God of the gaps. You know, I don't know, therefore God did it. I don't know, therefore God did it. And as you close these gaps, don't need God for lightning or thunder, we're going to explain everything naturalistically. Now, I want someone to, because I know we're short on time here. I want someone to ask about the God of the gaps in the Q&A. Okay, because there's lots that needs to be said. I'll just give you two quick responses. One, it gets God wrong. Okay, it gets God wrong. What do I mean? Well, we don't believe in a God of just the bits we don't understand. We believe in a God of the whole show. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created it all. And so when Newton discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, okay, now I can cross out God. No. He wrote the Principia Mathematica and said this was so that thinking men could read this, read about the law of gravity, and come to believe in God. Okay, so there was no conflict there. And yet many people treat it like, oh, it's science and God. And as soon as I have this scientific explanation, I don't need God anymore. No, that's a God of the gaps. And that's not what we believe in. We believe in a God of the whole show. Here's what Russell Calburn says. He's a fellowship at Royal Society, University of Cambridge, physicist. He says, understanding science doesn't make God smaller. It allows us to see his creative activity in more detail. I love that. It doesn't make God smaller. When we discover something, it allows us to see what God has been doing, whether it's gravity or something else. Getting close to the end here. Now, the other part of the God of the gap. So it gets God wrong, but it also misunderstands some of the arguments that are put forward. That there are some things out there, positive arguments that lead towards God. I don't say prove God, but what I would say is there's like these indicators that we find in science that point in the direction of theism and in the direction of God. And so here's Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew was an atheist for most of his life, philosophical atheist. And he wrote a book at the end of his life called There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. That's what he called it. And he says this in the book: I now believe the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. That's the origin of the universe argument. He says, I believe that the universe's intrinsic laws manifest what scientists have called the mind of God. That's the fine-tuning argument. Please ask me about the fine-tuning argument, okay? I got slides I want to share. I believe that life and reproduction originate in a divine source. He says this: why do I believe this, given that I have expounded and defended atheism for more than half a century? The short answer is this: this is the world picture, worldview, as I see it, that has emerged from modern science. Modern science, he changed his mind on the existence of God because of modern science. This is not a God of the gaps. I don't know, therefore God. Anthony Flew wouldn't have been convinced by a God of the gaps argument. Closing with 2 points. What does this have to do with the gospel? What does this have to do with the gospel? I'll tell you 2 things. One is that for some people, science is I call it a gospel. It's an obstacle of the faith. They don't even want to hear about Jesus and all that other stuff because they think I have to abandon thinking scientifically. And that's just not true. What we want to do is, I know there's a lot of Christians. We did the poll. A lot of you guys are at least theists. I'm assuming some of you are Christians. You want to remove that gospel. And how do you do that? You show science and faith are not in conflict. Okay. Machen, a theologian from 100 years ago, I call this Machen's mandate. He says, it should be ours to create, so far as we can, with the help of God, those favorable conditions for the reception of the gospel. Don't let science get in the way of someone believing the gospel. And we have, and there, because there's no conflict, And here's where I want to end. Second, when we study science, we get a glimpse of God. Okay. Scripture says the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day by day, they pour forth speech, and night by night, they reveal knowledge. But science doesn't go far enough. Okay. These are metaphors about speaking, but they're not real words, not literal words. Okay. We need a different kind of revelation if we want to know more about God. And the Christian worldview gives us that. When you jump into the New Testament, you find out that there's a fuller revelation there. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And then we find out verse 3, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made. So all the stuff we study in science was made through the Word. And then we find out the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus takes a physical form. Why? So he can solve a non-physical problem. A problem, by the way, that science can't solve. Science deals with the physical. Jesus comes and solves a spiritual problem. And so if science has been an obstacle for you receiving the gospel, I know there's some people who are agnostic and atheist joining us. My hope is that something that's said tonight through the presentation and through our Q&A would help remove that that obstacle of the gospel, and lead you toward hearing and receiving the good news of Jesus Christ. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for a wonderfully insightful message. I especially appreciated how you pointed out the Christian origins of science, and how you even highlighted some scientists from the past, very notable names like Faraday or Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, and how they were Christian too. So if what you hear today really interests you and you'd like to learn more, please feel free to fill out a follow-up form in the chat. Wow, that was a mouthful of F's. Now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, who will be answering questions alongside Tim during the Q&A session. Dr. Martha Brown. Martha is a virologist who received both her bachelor's and doctorate from Queen's University before going on to complete a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Sherbrooke. Shortly afterwards, she moved to Toronto as a researcher for Sick Kids Hospital, where she eventually joined the University of Toronto's molecular genetics department. She now both teaches and does research. She's been an active member of the Knox Church community ever since she moved here. Just another friendly reminder, if you have a question you'd like to ask, please go to slido.com and type in the code relevant. Once you've typed and submitted your question, students can upvote any particular questions they'd like to see answered in a very democratic process. Please note that we're operating on a tighter schedule than usual, so the Q&A panel will aim to end around 8:10, 8:15 p.m. So we may not be able to cover every single question posed. So the first question we have, by virtue of democracy, is Christianity compatible with the theory of human evolution?
Let Tim go first.
Okay, I'll start with this one. I mean, I actually knew this was going to come up because when it comes to science and faith, we could all think to ourselves, well, where is the conflict? You know, people say science and faith are in conflict. Well, where is it? And what I can think of, I'm scratching my brain over this, and one is going to be young earth creationism, and then maybe the evolution thing. Here's what you need to know. I'll preface with this. How God created is an in-house discussion between Christians. Okay. So, you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and you will be saved. And then there isn't like this exclamation, this little asterisk there that says, oh, plus you have to believe this view of creation. Okay. So I want to start with that. There's Christians who hold to young earth creation. There are Christians that hold to old earth creation. There are Christians that hold to theistic evolution. So those are three views, but there's kind of more views kind of worked into those three broad categories. Okay. So I would say that Christianity is compatible with evolution. Um, what what we would have to look at is, what does Scripture teach? Okay, and this is what Christians argue over. What does the Scriptures actually say? And I don't think Scripture is a science book. Okay, it's not a science textbook. We need to read the words in context. Okay, now this is hard because no matter what you say, someone is going to call you names. Okay. So I'm either going to get labeled, if I tell you my view, I might get labeled as a heretic, or I might get labeled as a fundamentalist. Okay. Depending on, which camp's throwing mud at me. So rather than just, tell you what I believe, to answer the question is, yes, they are compatible. Now, here's the thing though. I think Scripture does teach that there was a historical Adam. Okay. Now it just seems that way. It seems the way Paul talks about him, and the way the genealogies are set up, and the way Paul and Jesus referred to the first man. It just seems like that's right. And so if I was going to believe in some kind of human evolution, I would want to make sense of an Adam and Eve. And I think you can do that with genetics. Actually, there's a book just written recently by Joshua Swamidass, who's a biologist of some kind, geneticist maybe. And he argues that science is fully compatible with a historical Adam and Eve, looking at all the genetic data there. But I could be wrong about that too. So I want to have a big enough net when we ask this question that I don't start excluding Christians, people as Christians unnecessarily. Okay. So we want to tackle this issue with a lot of humility, but I'm interested in what Martha has to say about this.
Okay. Well, I'm not as deep about these things as Tim is, but my answer to the question is yes. I think they are compatible. I've lived with both of them for a very long time. I mean, living with both of them, certainly recognizing that people talk about the so-called theory of evolution, but even then you can talk about, well, what exactly do you mean by that? And certainly if you work in the biological sciences, you realize that just evolution, i.e. adaptation, mutation, selection, those things do happen. Things do evolve. They evolve on a certain time scale. And I think the bigger the organism, probably the longer the time scale. But in microbiology, we study viruses, we study bacteria. We can see those things changing over time. So things do and can change over time. I think that often when I hear people talk about evolution, the impression I get is that they're definitely kind of going back to Darwin, and certainly my colleagues who would argue for that and argue that the Bible is, well, a nice story, but not beyond that. I do not have that view, but I have colleagues who do have that view. And they would argue that life, the oldest common ancestor, was some kind of organism that developed by the appropriate things coming together over time, kind of randomly. And I don't believe that at all. I do believe that God made people and God made all those other things too. And what fascinates me is that the amount of commonality between people and certain animals, I mean, the gross anatomy is very different, but animals have 4 legs. We all have 4 limbs. And if you get into the genetics of it, then certainly, in genetics, we study model organisms. So we study fruit flies, we study yeast, those things are used because they're relatively easy to study, but they are used as models for higher organisms like ourselves, because most of us are not going to want to be willing to have experiments done on us. So studying us is much more complicated. Studying them is more tractable. But the commonalities at the molecular level are amazing. So the way I kind of came to see it, and it's just the way that I see it, I'm not making any profound statements, is that I do believe that God created heaven and earth. I do believe that God created everything in it, including us. How he did that, though, is another story completely. And that I don't know. So maybe there it is, God of the gaps. Maybe one day I'll find out, but I personally, I can live with that. I can live with knowing that he did it, but not knowing exactly how he did it. And even if you read through Genesis, the way that things appear, they appear in phases, and then they culminate with Adam and Eve. So they culminate with man and woman, with people. But all of those other things, as I said before, the commonality. So if things work in one organism, then a similar thing turns out to be used over and over and over and over and over, and applies to people as well. So it gets back to, I don't know how he did it, but I fully believe that he did do it, and I don't see a tension between. I don't see a tension between the two. I don't feel a tension anyway. So
I think what Alvin Plantinga says is, look, we have options here. If you're a materialist naturalist, there's one game in town, and that is a certain Darwinian or neo-Darwinian process. Okay. But when the Christian is open to special acts of creation of God using evolution, there are options available to us. And so, I don't know, it seems to be in a good place, because I can see from my, from my own opinion that, man, there looks like there's some special acts of creation going on here. Like God miraculously intervening. But then there's other things that it's like, there's forms of evolution that are, undisputed, it's just things adapting, changing, no problem. And so, Christians don't need to be, we always talk about this, and it often generates more heat than light. And what we got to do, look, there's a book called A Case for Theological Triage. Okay. Now I'm speaking to the Christians here. If you're listening to me, stop fighting over this. When it's like in the medical profession, if someone came to you and they have a paper cut, a broken ankle, and a gunshot wound to the chest, what are you going to treat first? Of course, the gunshot wound. As Christians, there's a hierarchy of doctrines. Paul calls the gospel a matter of first importance. What some of us do is we make everything of first importance, but that's not true. There are some things of secondary importance and tertiary importance. And as Christians, we got to do a better job at saying, here's the fundamental, here's the essential, the gospel, the deity of Christ, so on. And then there's these other things. And I would put, the days of creation, that kind of stuff, down in the tertiary level. And like, we can have good discussions about it, but at the end of the day, we got to have enough humility to say there's only so much information we have, and leave it at that. So there's my parting thought on that question.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that question. We'll be moving on to the next one. So this one's a two-parter. Is science the main cause of religion's decline in the West? And if so, how should Christians address misconceptions about religion and science?
Is science, say that first part again? Is science
the main cause of religion's decline in the West?
I don't think so. I think it's one of, I've done a bit of study on this, looking at, in particular, young people walking away from their faith. Okay. And there's been numerous studies done. And science, the incompatibility, or the so-called or alleged incompatibility between science and faith, is up there in the top 6 normally when you form a list. Okay. But there's other things like the exclusivity claims of Christ, like Jesus being the only way. That's a huge obstacle. Just general doubts, huge obstacle. The sex issues, whether it's, the Bible's view on transgenderism, homosexuality, all the sexual stuff. Okay. Put that into a lump. That's a huge issue. So when you go down the list of people kind of walking away from religion, Christianity in particular, there's a whole bunch of things going on there. So science is one of many. That's how I would answer the first part of that question.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought it was the main thing either. I certainly haven't looked into it, but I wouldn't have thought so. It might be there for some people, but I wouldn't have thought it would be the major reason. So
yeah, there are people who are just scientifically minded, right? And like they're the future engineers, or they're the ones who are, going into these fields. And so for them, that's the big thing. But for a lot of people, science isn't the main thing, right? And so it's going to be something else. And so when you look at, again, there's a lot of research being done on why people leave Christianity and leave faith in particular, in general. And you'll find it's pretty complicated.
Okay,
And the second part of that question, how should Christians address misconceptions? I mean, the stuff I already talked about. Understand faith, understand what science is, and understand worldview. We didn't get into all that stuff, but like naturalism, some people equate science with things like scientism. You can only know stuff through the scientific method, when that happens, of course, they're going to see the tension. But when you identify scientism and show that it's self-refuting, because the claim that you can only know things through the scientific method or through the sciences, that claim is not a scientific claim. That's a philosophical claim. And so it seems to me that hard scientism and even soft scientism don't hold up. They don't stand up.
well, another thing, just from a practical perspective, get to know some scientists who are Christians.
Yeah.
I know several. Most of my peers, I would say, are not Christians, but some are. And if you have the privilege to know some of those people, whether they're professional practicing scientists in the working field, or whether they're students like Alana, who gave her talk at the beginning, and then people can ask them, well, like one of her friends asked her, well, how can you be a Christian, and what do you do about this particular topic or that particular topic? And that kind of discussion can take place. And maybe in terms of what can scientists do about it, maybe we can do a better job of living out our faith or Christianity in our scientific environment. Maybe we can talk more about it. Maybe we can invite more questions about it, because sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes we might be living kind of in two worlds. We've got our church community and we've got our work community. And maybe we should be bringing those two, doing a better job of bringing those two together. And also in our church community to be talking about our scientific endeavors during the week, kind of thing, so that other people in the church community don't get into this, oh my goodness, you've got to be one or the other, you can't be both. So I think from a practical level, maybe the people who are Christians and are scientists should be talking about those things as we go about our daily lives.
It would be awesome if every church had like a Sunday school class taught by a scientist, just to talk through these issues, because there is this impression when you go into the church, You're just gonna, you learn this. We're just gonna learn the Bible. But there are these big worldview questions that come up, and science relates to this. And so to have someone skilled in the sciences to be able to talk, about these things, I think that would be great if every church had that.
For the next question, we have one, I think, more targeted towards Tim because you posed.
I told people to ask it.
What is the fine-tuning argument?
Sure. That's how you make sure you can answer questions, is you tell people what to ask. Okay. So do I have your permission to pull up some slides here? I'm going to, let's see here.
Yes.
You know what? Let me see. That's the wrong screen. There we go. Okay, so just very briefly, as briefly as I can get, fine-tuning is the idea that the universe has certain constants, parameters, quantities that are just right for the existence of life. Okay, and there's many. And I get people to imagine like all these dials that need to be set just right. And if you mess with the dials, then you make a universe that no longer can permit life. Okay. It turns out there's these ranges that are so precise. So you move the dial a little bit, you go from life permitting to life prohibiting. Okay. And like tuning, now most people aren't even going to get this because I'm sure in our audience, who's tuned a dial, right? I remember tuning a dial. My parents had an 83 Caprice Classic, and that's how you found the radio. You didn't push a button. You had to find the station. And it was only like you get static, and then the station would come in, right? And this is what we're talking about with this fine tuning. And so we got, brilliant physicists saying things like, the more I examine the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe, in some sense, must have known we were coming. Okay. Or Fred Hoyle, he says that it's like a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. And I won't go through all these quotes, but here's what I want to show you. Because there are theoretical physicists who play around with these numbers that we have, these constants and quantities in the universe, and see what happens. Not really in the universe, but like in their models. And so it'd be like taking the recipe of a cake and changing things up a little bit. Well, what happens if we take the eggs out, we take the temperature from 350 to 800, Fahrenheit or something? What happens to our cake? And so this is what these guys do. And one of the things that there's a book, and I want to encourage the physicists and scientists out there. It's called A Fortunate Universe, written by two scientists, two astronomers. One is a Christian, one's an atheist. So it is awesome. They both agree with fine tuning, but they both, they disagree. At the end of the book, you have one that says, well, it's a multiverse. The other one says, no, it's God, as the kind of like the explanation for fine tuning. Well, it turns out, I'm not going to go through all this chemistry with you, but everything is made up of, this is what we think currently, electrons and then quarks, up quarks and down quarks. So the neutron is 2 down, 1 up, and the proton is 2 up quarks and 1 down quark. Okay. So the up quark, down quark, and electron. Well, these have masses. And if you change these masses, you change the universe. And so, for example, the down quark, if you change the mass, and I can't see because the thing's in my way, but it's something like by a factor of 6, what happens to our chemistry? Gone. You basically only have hydrogen left. Okay. Just by changing the mass of the down quark. You change it for the up quark, and this one's a factor of 6. And then what happens? It's even worse. You only have neutrons floating around the universe. That means no planets, no stars, no galaxies, neutrons. You're not going to have life in a universe that's just free floating neutrons. And then finally, if you change the mass of the electron, factor of 2, you end up with that neutron universe again. Okay. And so this is like, and we could go through, I mean, I got a whole talk on fine tuning here. I'm not going to go through that, but that's essentially what fine tuning is. And to me, the best explanation, again, this is a fuller talk, but the best explanation is a designing intelligence behind it. And because chance just doesn't seem, chance just seems crazy. I mean, when you start to add up these numbers, and then the other explanation would be necessity. Those quantities and constants had to be that way. And we don't think that's true. They could have, why couldn't they be different? And so the fine tuning of the universe, it's amazing. Christopher Hitchens, before he died, he said for him, the strongest argument for God, he wasn't convinced by it, but the strongest argument for God was the fine tuning argument. And there's others who make the same claim. I mean, it's just powerful stuff. So I want to encourage people to look into this argument, A Fortunate Universe, published by Cambridge University Press. It is awesome to read about this stuff. Whether you're an atheist or a Christian or a theist, it's just awesome.
As a heads up, we will be wrapping up the Q&A within 7 minutes at 8:10 precisely. The next question, targeted towards both Tim and Martha, is: would the existence of alien life more intelligent than humans contradict Christianity?
I'll let Martha start with this one.
Okay, that's a good question. I don't think so. Personally, I guess my reaction to intelligent alien life, or my question about that, is always, but wouldn't God have told us that there was other intelligent life out there? And that's just my gut level reaction. But whether there is or whether there isn't, it would still be part of his creation, and I don't think it would change his relationship with us. And that's what Christianity is about, or that's how I see it. So yeah. I don't think it would change it.
I completely agree. And I would just add, in a sense, angels, the sons of God referred to in the scripture, you could say that these are highly intelligent beings, probably more intelligent than human beings, and God did make them. And that doesn't contradict Christianity at all, although of course the Bible talks about those beings. So there's plenty of room for other beings. And none of that would mean that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. We get contact from some being that flies in, it doesn't negate truths about Christianity that we know to be true, that Jesus rose from the dead. No, if you want to show that that's false, you got to show me, look at the evidence there. You can't point somewhere else. So it wouldn't contradict my faith.
So the next question is: great scientists like the one you mentioned in your talk, Tim, were Christians, but that was the default back then. How can you be sure that they would still be Christian today?
Yeah, that this comes up a lot. That's just the default. Everyone rode horses, so of course this kind of thing. It wasn't just that they were default Christians. It was Newton and Robert Boyle and Kepler. Some of these guys wrote more about theology than they did about science. So it wasn't like, I go to church, but I also do science, or I believe in God because that's what everyone believes in. These guys, when you do the research and look into what they've written, what they believed, they went deep into theology. Kepler, he even tells us in his writing, he wanted to be a theologian, but then he realized that he could glorify God through studying the heavens. So it's just a mistake to say that it was everyone believed it. Well, in the specific cases that we look at, when it comes to Boyle and Maxwell and Newton and the list goes on, it wasn't just a default. These guys thought they were truly worshiping God in what they were doing. And so that is completely set apart from just, it's the default. I don't know if Martha wants to add anything.
I don't think there's much to add, but I take the point that Yeah, they weren't just Christians because that was almost the only religion going in their part of the world at the time, but that they really were people of God. And that's, I think, what you're saying. And that's the important thing, because not everybody in that day and age would have been having that personal relationship with God. So whether or not they would have gone to church that week or something. So,
and there was people who weren't Christians too, right? Pierre Laplace, and there was others who wanted to, Laplace wanted to show Newton, who's boss. And so there, between the French and he had no need for God as a hypothesis. I mean, this is kind of this classic conversation that takes place where he, lays out his hypothesis for the solar system, and I forget who it is. The sire asks, where's God in your theory? Newton has God in his theory. Where's God in yours? Laplace says, I have no need of that hypothesis. This kind of idea. So there were people that didn't believe, and it just so happens that these men weren't just casual nominal Christians. They were the real deal. I mean, if they were alive today, we would be like, whoa, wow, these guys are amazing.
That does it for the Q&A session. A big thank you and round of applause to both Tim and Martha for so graciously offering your time to be here tonight. As an announcement to everyone, if you have any more questions that you'd like to ask in a more informal setting, we'll be having a post-talk Zoom right after this webinar. I'll give you more details about this in a few minutes. Now, I'd like to take some time to speak about Alpha Groups. Alpha is an interactive series which engages people in conversations about the Christian faith. It's a series of sessions focused on questions of life, faith, and meaning. Each session includes time to connect, watch a talk on a video, or share any thoughts or questions you have. Join us. We'll be meeting online starting the week of January 25th next week. If you're interested or would like to receive more information, please fill out the follow-up form in the chat. And finally, some housekeeping to close out the night, but there should be announcements. Yep, so I know that some of you may still have questions you want to ask. So there's going to be a post-talk Zoom at the link provided from 8:15 to 9 p.m. So right now, in a couple minutes. Additionally, more information about this post talk. It will be much more casual, non-webinar, not similar to the format we've just had. So you can have a chance to talk to the speaker and panelists Tim and Martha directly, or just ask questions in the chat. We'll also be going over some more Slido questions that we weren't able to cover just now. So join us if you want to listen. The Zoom link is on the slide. I also want to let you guys know that we have talks for the rest of the week. You can take a screenshot on the schedule on the slide on the left, or go to relevantseries.com for more information. Besides our talks, we have some other interactive events throughout the week as well. From 12 to 1 p.m. this Wednesday and Friday, we will be having AMA Ask Me Anything Zoom sessions. If you have a pressing question about your faith, or maybe many that you've logged in the back of your mind, come and ask George, a staff member at Power to Change and Westminster Chapel, who will attempt to answer your questions. If you want to try to stump George, or just want to listen to other people's questions, then you're invited too. From 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. On Tuesday and Thursday, and from 5 to 6 p.m. every evening, we also have perspective Zoom sessions. In these sessions, you can talk to volunteers and other attendees about 5 major topics: the nature of God, human nature, the meaning of life, the identity of Jesus, and the source of spiritual truth. So feel free to come along or invite a friend. We'd love to hear your voice or your perspective on these things. And just as a final wrap up, I'd like to thank everyone once again, all audience members, for coming out tonight to this talk. I know the format of this year is a bit different than in years past, but we've adapted brilliantly. I'd also like to thank the organizers of the event, as well as all university fellowships who volunteered, all volunteers, and everyone involved in planning. A special shout out to the AV, Terry Spratt, and our two lovely panelists, Barnett and Martha Brown, once again. Be sure to check out the Relevant Week schedule for other great talks. And if you want to attend the post talk, you can go to the link now. Have a good night.